I really appreciate being here. I haven't been to the Genealogy Center, but I have lived in the Midwest. I lived in Ohio for 3 years working at Oberlin College, so I passed through Indiana. And at the time, I wasn't as interested in genealogy as I am now, so I would have definitely stopped in Fort Wayne if I had the chance. I like to start off with this picture because it's a photograph that my uncle had after he passed away. People went through it and found this and said, "Oh, Grant, you might be interested in this." So I had kept it. And he was a pack rat, and everyone needs a relative in the family who is a pack rat, if you're a genealogist, because you never know what you're going to find. His brother, every time I go to Sacramento, seems to find something new that he can share with me. So this is a quick outline about the talk, how I got started in genealogy, and all these things you see on the screen. So I was at a family wedding, maybe when I was in my late teens or early 20s, and it was second cousins once removed of mine. So we were talking, and they said, "Did you know that we're in the 35th generation of Gongs?" And I actually am a generation later, so I'm in the 36th generation of Gongs. And I said, "No, how do you know that?" And they said they pulled out this what they call a japu or a japu in Cantonese, and said, "Yeah, that's our family down at the bottom." And I said, "Well, that's really amazing." And but what does it all mean? And they pulled out a translation of it as of the 70s, and those are all relatives of mine. And the man on the left, Gong Hik, is my great great grandfather. He's the one who first came to the U.S. in our family. And then you can see there's, he had 4 kids, and the ones we know a lot of are the ones that where his descendants came to the U.S. And so there's a lot of people in China I don't even know about, but you can see there's lots and lots of names. And that got me interested in genealogy. First, not at that high level, and later on, it got to where I was spending hours at the National Archives in San Bruno. But it's good to know a little perspective behind all our genealogy work. There are a lot of restrictions to Asian entry and survival in the US. It all started with the founding fathers of in the Naturalization Act of 1790, who said that only free white persons could become naturalized citizens. Later on, after the Civil War, people from Africa were added to that list so that people who were brought here as enslaved people could become naturalized citizens, but Asians were not allowed to until the 1940s and 50s. There were foreign miners taxes. There were taxes in San Francisco on laundries that operated in wooden buildings, because those were the only laundries that were operating in wooden buildings were owned by Chinese. The brick building ones were not owned by Chinese. So then there were anti-Asian groups like the Working Men's Party. There were lynchings in Los Angeles, anti-Asian riots all throughout the West, and exclusion acts finally greatly reduced the numbers of Chinese coming to the US. And then after Chinese were excluded, Japanese were tapped as another source of inexpensive labor. And then they were restricted too by the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which said Japanese laborers could not come to this country. There are state alien land laws in California and other places that said if you were foreign born, you could not own land. And then the 1917 and 24 Immigration Acts on the federal level served to keep family apart. Restricted not only Asians, but Southern and Eastern Europeans. It greatly reduced the amount of immigration from those countries. And then there were barriers for Filipino immigration once Philippines' status changed from a U.S. territory, which it had been since 1898, until 1934, when it became a future independent country, which was to take effect in 1944. So it was an odd combination of Filipinos who wanted independence and anti-Philippine activists who said, "Oh, if the Philippines become a country, they'll be governed by the quota that or they'll be governed by restrictions on Asian immigration as well." Even after World War II, there were still quotas on a lot of different groups. And then covenants against Asians living in certain neighborhoods in places like San Francisco. And then Chinese were definitely victims of the red baiting in the 1950s. So this is a view of immigrants coming through Angel Island. It was one of the main facilities for Asian immigration, probably the main one on the West Coast. There were also immigration facilities in places like Seattle, New York, and the Mexican and Canadian borders, but the largest numbers were in the US. The earthquake of 1906 created an opportunity for Chinese to get around these exclusionary laws. There were all the records in the Hall of Records in San Francisco were destroyed. And so people would claim to have been born in the US and have birthright citizenship, which was established by the Supreme Court case where a man named Wong Kim Ark was successful in saying that if you were born here, no matter the status of your parents, you were a citizen. So that right of birthright citizenship, fortunately for my family and many others, is still the case today. So here's a picture of Angel Island. And as I mentioned, when the earthquake destroyed all these records, a lot of people would say they were born here with that status. And so they would bring their families over from China, but sometimes they would claim to have children who were also from China, and these children, as the children of natural-born Americans, could come to this country. So although this sounds very devious and dishonest, it was the only way around these very restrictive laws that only affected Chinese. And places like Angel Island, people were detained for a long time because the authorities would try to verify that people who said they were the sons and daughters of people who were born here were really that sons and daughters. They check how they looked and they interrogate them with all kinds of questions, which I'll get into later. And so the poem that you just saw is translated this way, that there are different exclusion laws that implicate me, that keep me from coming to this country. And so the poet is recalling a famous mythological hero named Zhu, who was a hero. The second one is this person was able to be admitted into this country. And so the line that says, even if it is built of jade, it has turned into a cage, refers to the green walls in the building, which were kind of jade green. And so kind of an encouraging and auspicious color. But for many, this jade actually turned into a cage. But Chinese didn't just sit back passively. They filed thousands of lawsuits, Chinese and Asians in general. There were cases where Ozawa is a case where Japanese said, we should get the rights to citizenship as well. And same thing in the Thin case, I believe. I mentioned the paper sons and daughters, and to get around the alien land laws, I'm sorry, people would put land in their American-born children's names, even if they were very young, because that was the only way they could own land. Finally, the Exclusion Acts were repealed in 1943, and the War Brides Act established gave a rebirth to the Chinese community, because before that, there were laws against women coming over, and so the number of Chinese families in places like San Francisco was very small. And so eventually the War Brides Act allowed families to form. And so that's why many people had a Chinese immigrant man who had been here for many years and a much younger woman from China who had come over in the 40s and 50s. And naturalization was finally allowed in the 40s and 50s, and the civil rights movement helped reduce housing discrimination. And finally, the Immigration Act of 1965 created more opportunities. And that's the subject of this graph, which I found online. A woman named Talia Braunstein created this wonderful map showing immigration in the US and the different places where people came from. And you can see up until 1924, when the Immigration Act was passed, immigration had been peaking in the 19 teens, and mostly from Europe, but you can see Italy and Ireland are bright green and quite large numbers. Red number is from Russia. But you can see the very thin yellow line across the top. But even with those small numbers, Chinese were still scapegoated and targeted. And that's why the Exclusion Act in 1882 continued to reduce the population. You can see there's still some who got through the immigration process or had children. And so but the numbers were still very, very low in comparison to everybody else. And you can see after 1965, when the immigration acts where immigration was greatly liberalized, that the numbers would grow a great deal. These are some of the laws that restricted Asian immigration and later on that helped Asian immigration. And then some of the countries where people came from are highlighted here. More recent days, people from India and China are still coming in great numbers, as well as throughout Asia. The second line, the second from the bottom yellow section is what that refers to, that Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. The Asian population has gotten a lot more diverse over the past 50 years. And this graph shows the numbers of Asian American and Pacific Islanders that have greatly grown since 1965. You can see they come from many different countries. Well, I'll go back there and see. The largest groups these days are mostly Asian Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, and Koreans, and Vietnamese. So the Southeast Asian numbers are pretty large. Then if you look at the current day population, you can see the diversity of Asian Americans. And then the graph on the right shows the estimates of the population into 2060. And if you see the purple line, those are people who are from roots from pre-1965. And that's where most of the documents are. So if you're an Asian American researcher and your family came, during the exclusion era or when there's still quotas, there's chances that you'll find documents. But for more recent immigrants, there are fewer documents because there haven't been as many restrictions and fewer questions to ask. But ideally, if you're in the first or second generation, you'll have access to grandparents and people who came over, and they can tell their stories. And it's just like with any group, it's really important you talk to the elder population to fill you in as much as they can. And you can see about 6 in 10 Asian Americans were born in another country, which is quite a large number. So there's challenges to Asian American research. Genealogists are trained to look for documents like censuses, obituaries, probate, wills, etc. But often you have to, for doing research, find out who, if the name you're looking for is really the name of your family. For example, my name really last name is Gong. That's my ancestral name. I'll tell you later about my grandfather coming over. Many immigrants sometimes went by different names in the census from decade to decade. I've seen 2 or 3 different names for my grandparents. Chinese men, even in China, would take different names as they proceeded throughout their lives. They'd have what they call a milk name that they're born with, and then a generational name, which people can tell who's related to whom, marriage names, and many other things. So your research can have many challenges. And often our ancestors' obituaries are not in English language papers, but you might have to find an Asian language paper. And many of us, like me, unfortunately, do not read those other languages. And then there might not be probate records because Asians often could not own land. So there are a lot of challenges. But there are some silver linings because of all the restrictive laws and the efforts of groups like Save Our National Archives to preserve them. Extensive documents remain for your review among certain people, as I mentioned, usually coming before 1965. These include case files, special records, court cases, certificates of identity, and so on, which I'll show you some of coming up. And the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II often created detailed documents, and they often will tell you where your ancestors came from in Japan. And there's naturalization documents. When people could finally naturalize, those documents, of course, are very valuable. They have a lot of information on hometown, children's names, where they were born, and things like that. And in the 50s and early 60s, there were what was called the confession program, where Chinese who came over using false names could get their old names back and become citizens. But unfortunately, during that process, you'd often have to tell who your paper family was, and then they'd be hauled in and questioned. And so it was not a lot of people participated in that program. But if you can find those documents, they're very valuable as well. So online, places like Ancestry and Family Search, you can find some great things. There are ship manifests, and make sure you look at the second page, not on the one shown here, but on the bigger ship manifest. There's always some good information on addresses in the home country, things like that. Now, who someone was traveling with, who paid for the passage, and so on. And there are sometimes many special records which were required when people immigrated. And there are sites like archives.gov, which have a lot of case files for immigration, and also during World War II, that are on archives.gov. And be sure to click on research our records, and not necessarily just the main page, because there's a better search engine once you go a little deeper into their website. There's also sites like My China Roots that have a lot of good information, as well as the usual Ancestry and Family Search. So just like for anyone, the classics, birth, marriage, and death records can lead to information about the immigrant generation, maiden names, etc., which are very useful. This is for a woman named Yuri Nakahara, who later became Yuri Kochiyama, a very important Asian American activist in New York and the West Coast. So you can see her father was a fish market proprietor, and mother, you have her maiden name, and she's listed as a housewife, but you have birth dates and all kinds of things like that. And then Yuri was a twin, which is interesting. And it has the addresses and things like that. And then here's like half of one of the immigration record, where this was dated on someone's arrival May 6, 1918. During early COVID, my wife and I decided to do research on her grandfather's first wife. We heard she died in the early 1900s, and we wondered if it was the flu, the influenza virus that had gone around the world during that time. So we found her on the ship manifest. There she is, Turie Tonai, listed as a housewife, and her mother's address in Wakayama. It's really her mother-in-law's address. And then we found out what he did. Her husband was in San Francisco and he lived on Laguna Street in San Francisco. And then we found her death record in the California Death Index, dying on October 22nd, 1918. So we wrote to Los Angeles, and surprisingly, during COVID, we got a very quick response, getting her death certificate in the mail. And it listed that, there she is, and then it listed that she had died of bronchopneumonia on October 21st, but the contributory factor at the bottom you can see was influenza. So she'd only been in the US for a few months, but she caught the flu during that time and passed away. So we learned a lot about her that way. Different documents come in different eras. Before exclusion, there's not a whole lot of paperwork. So if your ancestors came before 1882, there's not a whole lot of paperwork, because there weren't the ship manifests you see after that time. But sometimes they made trips back home, and you might find their ship information that way. During the exclusion era, there was a lot of information, but even if you were among the exceptions, there were exceptions to the Exclusion Act for people like merchants, students, diplomats, and travelers, or teachers too. So often some like we found I.M. Pei's document. He came as a student, so the famous architect had an easy time. I saw a speech he gave for a naturalization ceremony, and he said he came through Angel Island, and he didn't have a very difficult time at all because he was a student. So the government assumed he was not going to stay, so it was okay for him to come. And then on the East Coast, sometimes there were sailors from many countries, including China, who jumped ship. So people from Europe and Asia who were sailors, seamen, would often just jump ship and disappear into the country. And of course, you probably won't find any immigration documents for them unless they got caught. And then I mentioned that immigration greatly increased after 1965. So here's the example of a Chinese arrivals record. There was an example of the special documents that you had. So this is for immigrants who arrived in 1918. And so this is Mr. Wong here has a lot of information on his record. And if you blow it up, you can see he was provisionally denied entry. It looks like some questions were made to Minneapolis. He probably had family there. And the whole process took quite a long time. He arrived here in May 1918, and it looks like he finally was released in September of 1919. So he was on the island for about 16 months, it appears. And you can see on the far right, it says when he was finally admitted. And then he's landed on parole, so he had to probably produce a bond of some sort. This is another family, a man who came in as a laborer originally, and he was a laundryman from Huiping on his way to return to New York. So he had come over before exclusion and somehow was able to return to the United States after his trip there. And then listed as his hometown was Sunning, which is near Toisan, where many, many Chinese immigrants came from that whole area. The Sayup counties, four different counties in China produced most of the immigrants, or many of the immigrants, to the US. And it lists where his family's from, his business address in Chicago, and then also his place of birth. So you can find a lot of great information on these immigration documents. Census records often have the dates of immigration, but 1910, 1920, 1930, you can see it lists the date of arrival, but they're all listed as AL for alien because they couldn't become citizens even if they wanted to be naturalized. So the person above in 1930 was, the two people above were not Chinese, so they became naturalized, but the bottom person was still listed as an alien, even though he had been in the US for 55 years. In the 1940 census, it doesn't have that question anymore, so you won't know when your ancestor came to this country, but you will know where they lived 5 years before. So mobility was a very important concern in 1940. But occasionally you will find challenges. For example, here in California, this is a list of people working in Contra Costa County, which is east of San Francisco. I'll blow it up a little bit here. And you can see all the men are listed as John Chinaman. Their home birthplace of them and their parents were all listed as China, but they all seem to have the same name. Well, Chinaman was not a complimentary term. It was just kind of like, oh, he's just a Chinaman, that kind of expression. But you can see the census taker never bothered to find out the names of these men. And you can see that even in the second section, there's a farmer listed, but all the men who worked on the farm were listed as John Chinaman. So that's, if you have an ancestor, you think they might have worked in that part of the county in 1880, you won't find them listed by name, unfortunately. And because the 1890 census was mostly lost, it will be very difficult to find your family's whereabouts. So many great documents are in the National Archives, especially in San Bruno, because San Francisco was a major port of entry, as I mentioned. But sometimes you'll find them elsewhere in the country, although I just heard the New York Archives is going to be closed and its resources moved to places like Philadelphia. Many obituaries and things like that are not online, especially those in Asian language newspapers. Sometimes it's worth finding someone, who's literate to pay them to do some research. This is a document found in a immigration file for Sun Shi. If you find Shi, that's basically Ms. or Miss. So Ms. Sun was almost 5 feet tall. She was listed as a housewife in Cortland, which is a small rural town in the Sacramento River Delta where my mother grew up. And then you can see this is a man and his son. We don't know if it's his real son or his paper son coming to. So the people who are here would have to register that they're citizens. They were born here. They go to the Hall of Records in San Francisco, and if they're supposed to be born before the earthquake, they would say I was born in 1902 or something, and no, they'd be much older than that, maybe 1880, and they'd like to get a new birth certificate. And then they say that to the immigration department, I was in China. I made a visit, and when I was there, I got married and I had 3 kids. So I want to bring them all over. So this is another document for a cousin of mine. And inside the document, you find this wonderful photograph of the family because he had to show that he was related to them. And it has a lot of good information on addresses, family names, and so on. Again, these are all in the National Archives. And then New York, here's a sample of what you can find in New York City, showing an immigrant who lived in New York, and then he's getting a return certificate stating he's a citizen. He wants to go to China and return. And in this case, there's a man named Li Chong who wants to register his son, and his son is part African American, which is really fairly unusual, but it shows that it did happen, and he was taking him back to China to visit. And then here's another case where he's stating he is a citizen and he wants to bring his son back, and here's all the pictures. So they would compare the pictures of the son when he came, with the person who came over. And this is my cousin's research, Michael Ho. He found an obituary for his grandfather who died in Honolulu. And it had some good information, all the people who survived him, as many obituaries do, which is really very helpful. But then he also found it in Chinese, and that produced a lot more information because I mentioned that Chinese have more than one names often. And so I listed his alternate names and all their descendants and their spouses, which was really a very useful thing. For Japanese Americans, there aren't a whole lot of early records. Before 1907, there were no restrictions on Japanese immigration. Many Japanese went to Hawaii when it was an independent country or a territory to work on plantations, then later came to the continent. During the Gentleman's Agreement, many of the women, well, I mentioned that Japanese laborers were no longer allowed in this country, but if they were here, they could send for their families. And if they were single, they would have an arranged marriage with someone in Japan, often using the families as working with a go-between, someone called a baishakurin, who would determine the suitability, and the man would send his picture. So many Japanese immigrants were questioned on board their ships and have no immigration files. But there are also extensive records on the Japanese incarceration, Japanese American incarceration in the U.S. by the government during World War II. One person you focus on is Kane Mineta. She was married by proxy in Japan to a man named Kunisaku Mineta. And so her file is in the National Archives in San Bruno. And she mentions she was married by photograph in 1912 and had not been married. So she only had like 3 questions. They asked the husband more questions, make sure he has money to support her, that, you can see he's got money invested in his business. He has a partner who's an American citizen, who presents his passport and all these other things. And he was married by photograph again. And that presents a copy of the family register, which is very valuable. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the family register is often in these files in the National Archives. And so the Minettas were sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming during World War II. You can see Kane and her husband Kunisaku, along with their children, Albert, Etsu, and Norman. And you can see it has birth dates, which are really wonderful. It has their alien registration number, which leads to what are called A files, or alien files, filed with the National Archives. Some of them are in the West Coast, some of them are in Kansas City. And then where they came from before the war, and then what happened to them after the war. So some people were released before the end of the war. You can see the different categories. There's an individual release for education purposes, which Albert did. Second one was to join the family. That's Etsu. And then the third one, invitation. So people in Illinois invited some Japanese Americans to go there to live during the war. So Kane Kunisaku went to Evanston and Chicago. I'm assuming they eventually reunited in Chicago. And then Norman joined them because he was the youngest. He was only about 12 when they went to Illinois. And here's their petition for naturalization. You can see all kinds of good information, which I mentioned, the birthplace in Shizuoka, and where the family lived in the 1950s when Kane became naturalized, and her birth name Watanabe, which of course is very valuable. That opens up a whole new branch of the family. In case you haven't guessed by now, Norman is Norman Mineta, who eventually got a presidential Medal of Freedom. He was Secretary of Treasury when 9/11 happened. He was a secretary of both Clinton and Bush, and he had been the first Asian mayor of San Jose and first in the Congress from that area. For Korean American information, early 20th century, after Korea was annexed by Japan, it did not allow many people to leave the country, but there's a small number of Korean picture brides as well. Some managed to get into China and immigrated from there, but of course they were still subject to the Exclusion Acts. And some went to Hawaii first, especially work on the plantations, and some of them were able to move to the continent. The neat thing is that volunteers have scanned, I think, all the Korean immigration files held at the National Archives. So if you're looking for a Korean immigrant from the first half of the 20th century, you might find their records from San Bruno on archives.gov just by searching for their name. So here's the story of Rose Park, who came over in 1914. She was a young girl. And she came, let's see, it doesn't have her age in here, which I always thought was interesting that some of these records do not have age. And she was, it looked like she had measles, which is on the right end of the red circle. But she was admitted in 1910, and you can see she traveled with what are her actually her mother and her stepsister as well, or half-sister, actually half-sister. And so this image happened to be in the Angel Island Museum, the immigration barracks, and then her family saw the young girl's picture and said, "Oh, there's grandma." And so we ended up doing a lot of research about her and found out about her marriage and much more than that, including the naturalization files, and the family ended up being supportive of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. For Indian immigration information, there was a small amount of Indian immigration to the US in the early 20th century, but they also had the highest rate of deportation on Angel Island. After Chinese and Japanese came through and had restrictions against them, a number of Indians started immigrating from especially the Punjab area. And so the anti-Asian forces ramped up again and said, okay, well, there's no laws against them, but we can put pressure on the Angel Island authorities to restrict their immigration. So that's when you'd see a lot of people listed as likely to become a public charge, because if people were deemed likely to be government support, that they would be restricted as well. So they were affected by the Asiatic Barred Zone, which passed Congress in 1917. And you might find their records. This is for someone named Kihar Singh, and he traveled with about 19 other men in their 20s and 30s from the Punjab area. And there he is. And then we found documents about all these men were held because they had hookworm, which is another way they would keep people out of this country. It was treatable, but you had to have the money to go to the Angel Island Hospital to have that treated. And then he had trachoma, another disease as well. And there he is. And it's interesting that the case against him was he's a laborer. There's no demand in this area of California for this class of labor. And also there's a prejudice among the people of this locality against this class of labor. They're not saying against this race or ethnicity, but they're just saying there's a class. And so they were recommended to be arrested. So that's what we found in the file. And then later, 35 years later, there's a document saying, oh, he was discharged by this US Supreme Court, which is fascinating. So we were able to find some more information in files about him. Kihar Singh's granddaughter, Valerie Kaur, is an activist now. She's a filmmaker, and she was very active going around the country after 9/11 in 2001, trying to combat all the violence that was going on against different Asian American groups, especially Sikh Americans. And so we were able to take her and her family to Angel Island, where her grandfather had been kept, and give them a tour, and so they could learn all about their family history. A lot of Filipinos were coming to this country between 1898 and 1934. They were considered US nationals, so they could travel back and forth. But then the Titanic-McDuffie Act said that the Philippines would become independent in 1944, but put a quota on Filipino immigrants that I mentioned before. So in the handout, there's a number of links to videos, and this is about Eliseo Felipe's return to the US when he came in 1934, where he was initially denied entry because he was not part of that 50-person quota. But then he told them, well, I had a job before I went to the Philippines. So he was able to be released once his employer vouched for him. And then more recent immigrants, like refugees from Vietnam and so on, have naturalization documents online, but there's not as much information as you can see about the family and spouses that there were in the past. So in the handout, it has a lot of information on where you can go for research, National Archives and other sources, how to search. So quickly talk through some of my family's documents. This is my maternal grandfather's certificate of identity, which Chinese were given after they were released. And fortunately, this survived his passing in the 1960s, and we still had it in the family in the 1980s. And so that led to me going to the National Archives. And they also have copies of these in the archives. So if you don't have one of these yourself, they might have it. And that includes a case file number. You can see that 17887 number. And we thought, oh, with this document, we know he first came to the US in 1919. He's a merchant, and he came in 1919. But the archives had more. They had this document that showed that he actually came through Canada in 1905. He walked across the border to Sumas, Washington, and 14 years before we thought he had come to this country. And you can see there he shows up in a different spelling of his name, much, much different. That's probably why I didn't find it before, that he came through Sumas, and then he ended up traveling to California. He was detained at the border for 5 days, and he had a Section 6 certificate, meaning he came as a merchant, as one of the exempt class members. And there is Sumas. Someday I will go there, but I hope it's soon. That's the first place our family set foot in the United States. He had to prove merchant status to show that he had money, he had a business, and he had to have a bank draft. He presented a bank draft worth $1,000 and about $100 in gold and paper money. Back then, those were large sums of money. And my aunt said, and my mom said, the family was not well off. So my theory is that people shared these bank drafts and when they came to this country among people who were partners in this business. And then he returned to China to get married as a merchant at the time. There were not the restrictions on that. And then his wife came over and she was questioned extensively to corroborate the story. And she brought my grandfather's nephew, who he claimed was a son from a first marriage. So even though he's a paper son, he was still part of the family. And my grandparents went on to have 6 children and lived in a small town called Cortland, which I'd mentioned before. And there's her certificate of identity and a picture of them in the archives. My grandmother died when my mother was only 5, and so she didn't have any pictures of her. And so the documents we found in the archives were among the only pictures we have of our grandmother. So we're very fortunate in that way. Family trips to Cortland helped us learn a lot about our history. And there's my grandfather in the white tie. And the second one has a picture of the house. Friends of the family showed us around and we said, oh, that's probably the family house. Because when my mom would take us to visit, she always showed us this empty lot where her house was. And that's the burial site of my grandmother. And my grandfather's, as a merchant, he couldn't work as a laborer, so he had to have jobs like he helped out at the store and he bought and sold fish from in town. He did some calligraphy for this auditorium building that was built in honor of a Chinese general who came to town. On my dad's side, my grandfather was a paper son, so he had to pretend he was the son of a man named Ao, and Ao had his records from the Hall of Records showing his certificate of birth that he was born in the U.S. And again, our family's real name is Gong, but he had to pretend his name was Ao Lun. And they would ask him all these questions like this: who lives all over the village and things like that. They basically sketch out like who lived in the village, and not only would they compare this information with his father, they'd also compare it with other people who came from the village. So if those people gave their incorrect information, it was tough for subsequent immigrants. So in this letter, it says the central trip is established where the alleged father was in China at the time when my grandfather was conceived, and then he was landed as a native, and everything seems kosher between my father and his father. So my grandfather and his father. And so I recommend the applicant be landed. That's why we're in this country. And then all the questions he had to ask. Oh, this is his real brother testified, but because he had papers for a different man, they had to pretend they were just friends from school. And so they would be their witness. My paternal grandmother came over and she had a whole nother story where she had to pretend that she was the wife of her husband's brother because his paper said he was married and my grandfather's paper said he was single. So there's all kinds of things. It's really difficult to track sometimes. So she was asked all kinds of things about, what's in the village, what signs are there, all kinds of things. It's just incredible that anyone ever got through this. Asked about her, and finally, she was released, favorably treated. And again, this is my paternal grandfather, his wife, and his brother. I really recommend family reunions, talking to family members, even if they aren't your direct ancestor. This is my uncle who had gone back to the village in China and had pictures of his grandparents, which are my great-grandparents. And then a bunch of the cousins were all in China at the same time. They had a laundry in Woodland, which is near Sacramento, so we could trace where they were then. And then because my Uncle Jack helps lead tours with a man named Dino in the lower left, Dino has plaques all over town and commemorates the family's laundry, which was in Woodland. So it's really exciting. But you could see in 1940, my grandfather is listed as the head of a household, but his wife and children are all listed as lodgers because he was technically not supposed to be married to his wife. She was his brother's wife. So in this case, he had to pretend all these people living in his house were not really related to him. Imagine that. In 1930, he had said they were his children. So, or else perhaps someone else in the family filled out the census or responded to the census taker. And then with all these stories, it's very entertaining. Sometimes Dino found this article about when my Uncle Hank was born, that they mentioned there are 9 little Dins. There's really only 8. One of them is a nephew. Mr. Din is proud of his thriving family, but he's vague about their names and ages. I love that. There are 2 children who were born in China. Supposedly, I think those were just slots, so they could sell those slots, and I don't believe he ever did. And then my uncle broke his leg. His picture made it into the newspaper because his sister had rigged up these crutches out of tennis rackets. And so it made it into the paper, which got picked up by the wire services. And so people all over the country were sending money to the poor Chinese family where they couldn't even afford crutches, but they really could. And then this is a family picture. So I really encourage you to have reunions. This is several branches of our family. Our common ancestor is my great-great-grandfather, but because we have genealogists in many branches of our family, it's really great because everyone prepared a PowerPoint. They were able to fill us all in on the different branches of our family. And then we've had Zoom calls too. When we found a new person in that first family tree that I found, there was someone who was descended from someone who spelled his name Kong instead of Gong. And so we found her through a DNA test. Eventually I met her in Chicago, and her mother was very avid, very excited about all this too. One cousin has this really nice family tree and presented, man, you can see Lee in the military uniform, and sadly he had died in Europe in World War II. And so our cousin found some information about him. I found some more things, and his name is on this monument in San Francisco, Gong Bifong, in honor of Chinese who died in World Wars I and II. And then I love collaborations because Gong Gim Hick, my great-great-grandfather, is said to have come from, worked on the railroads. And so the story of the railroads have always been very important to me. And my cousin found a lot of information. I found some books and scholarly books. Cousin Verna found this file for her grandfather, who is actually my great-grandfather's brother. And through that, she found a picture of my great-great-grandfather, her great-grandfather, and it talks more about his history. It has this wonderful photograph of him. And then a little bit about him, that when he went back to China, he was 55 years old. He worked in a tin shop, and he was in farming. So all these things, all from the National Archives files about his son. So Verna and I eventually went to visit Hanford, where he had lived, according to the documents. And look, there's a streets called Canton Street, or Canton, they might pronounce it like in Ohio, and Lotus Lane. There's also, I think, a Shanghai Street. So there are enough Chinese that they would do that. And that led to me feeling very confidently, especially with an oral history that Verna's grandmother had done with her grandson. No, Verna's mother had done with her grandson, where she said that her grandfather had worked on the railroad. And so there's a picture of me at the 150th anniversary of the completion of the railroad. So as I wrap up, there are these wonderful documents. I mentioned the Japu or Zupu. They're from China. Koreans have something called Jokpo. Vietnamese have Jaffa. And they're not found in all families, but places like the Family Search Library, My China Roots, all have resources to try to find them. My China Roots has digitized many of them online. And then there's an example of a page. And again, we've had reunions based on the Japu, or we've had families who are all in the book, their parents. And unfortunately, it's mostly men who are in these books, but they can trace their grandparents in the books, and we can figure out how we're all related to each other. So the previously mentioned cousin Michael and I have created a family tree. You can see how large it is. It goes across many parts of the room. And Michael has annotated the pages for the Japu so people can find out how to relate to each other. I was given this photograph at an Owyang reunion, which is really great because our family did not have this. And then Koseki are another document you can find in Japan. They don't go back as far, but they often talk about different family relations. You need to have documentation that show you're related to the people who are in the village, and they're often at the city records offices. And there are websites listed in the handout about places that will help you do that research. And you may even go to Asia. This is a Chinese group, Friends of Roots, that helps people go to China. I don't know if they've restarted their program. They were going to go during 2020, but of course, COVID got in the way. So I'm hoping they'll be starting up again. This is my trip back to my family's village in China with a bunch of cousins. They're all Owyang's, and I was able to meet my step grandmother and my half cousins and half aunt as well. My wife and I found in her great grandfather's immigration records that the name of her great grandmother, which she knew, but also the address that we thought, well, maybe they're still there, family members. And sure enough, we went back to, we went to that village and found the monument that she had a picture of her great grandmother in front of. Over 100 years ago, you found the same monument in the same location in the house, and learned that there were all these names carved into the back of family members who had gone to America. So there they are. And then finally, as Allison mentioned, there were Chinese on the Titanic. There were 8 who set sail from Southampton and 6 who survived through various means. And I wish I had time to tell you more about it, but there's a film called The Six that someday will, I hope, be distributed in this country. There are no DVDs, or it hasn't been streamed yet, but keep an eye out for it. If it comes out, I'll tell Allison about it. So anyway, remember that picture at the beginning? There was these women that we didn't know of. And so I talked to my cousin Cameron, he's second from the left, and Cameron said, hey, we have a cousin, Howie. He works at the butcher shop at the supermarket across the street. I said, wait, we have a cousin in Sacramento, and he's been here for 20 years, and you haven't told the genealogist of the family about him? So let's go meet him. Yes. So he was able to talk to his mom, who had also immigrated, and find out the names of all the people in the family in the photograph, and find that this picture was taken in Vietnam. And from there, I was able to add them all to my family tree that I had their names already through other means. But it was just amazing. I always tell people, sometimes you look far and wide for the documents, but the answer might just be right across the street. So I hope I still have some time left to answer any questions. And I really appreciate you tuning in today. And feel free to email me along the way.
What a fantastic story there at the end, being able
Thanks.
to identify the people. That's what we want for all of our photos.
Yes, we do.
Oh, it's so cool. Thank you. All right, we do have some questions. So we'll start with the very first one that came in. Someone's asking, what is red baiting? How did this affect immigration efforts?
Well, during the 50s, there was a lot of fears that communists were infiltrating. Well, they had taken over Mao Zedong had taken over China in 1949. So after that, there was on many different occupations, especially Hollywood, people would be accused of having connection with communists. So Chinese being here and being one generation often removed from China were often feared for having some ties. So people were like family member, friends of mine's father was dragged before the House Un-American grandfather, sorry, House Un-American Activities Commission to say, do you have ties to China? And basically, he showed movies from China, like um, fictional movies, and so he pled the fifth all along. But that kind of thing did happen.
Okay, so someone is researching a woman who was a nursing student in the early 1940s at Seattle University. Um, her this the student didn't show up one day to class, and they later found out that her and her family were sent to an internment camp.
Oh,
Um, Densho gave me ideas on who she might be based on ceremony about 10 years honoring students who were interned, but I'm struggling to find her family, i.e., parents, siblings, etc.
hmm.
Any suggestions? I think she ended up in Colorado.
Oh, okay. Um, it does. If you know her name, um, you can find a lot of records through the National Archives, and also Ancestry has lists of what's called a final accountability roster, which are really helpful. You can just search by name, and they'll sometimes be listed by family, and some camps listed them alphabetically. So you might find different members separated. Like let's say there's a lot of Ozawas, you'd have to look for the family members by family number. But those are places to look. Densho has a really good 10-part genealogy series that my friend Linda Harms Okazaki presented that helps you find that kind of information. But the like Ancestry and Family Search do have a fair amount of those records. That um, yeah, if you have problems, just shoot me an email. It's in my address is in the handout. It's kind of hard to explore all the avenues on the screen, but there you should be able to find more information about that person, especially if you know the state where they were, because there's only like one or two camps per state generally.
That's fantastic. I hope you're able to find that, Debbie.
Yeah, hope so.
So, um, that's all the questions
Oh,
that we're gonna
okay.
get to today. We're a little short on time, so
Yeah,
I just
sorry, I
wanna
talked
make sure.
so much.
No, 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 it was perfect. It was so interesting, and thank you so much, Grant, for joining us today and presenting. I know I got a lot out of it, and I believe our attendees did as well. So thank you, and
Thank
our
you.
attendees, thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you on Thursday. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Take care, everybody.